Welcome back to the Infinity Person Hypothesis. We're looking at this episode of what happens when something goes wrong in our relationship with an infinity person. What happens then? The problem has to do with broken relationships. It's possible to have a social, communicative infinity person, but there still could be a broken relationship. It's no surprise when we humans are selfish and evil that there is a grievance against this infinitely good person. What happens then? Think about it. An infinite person, everything about him is infinite, including his response to people like us. He's infinitely personal and takes everything we do infinitely personally, the bad and the good. And that's important to consider because, well, it's not a light thing to offend an infinity person. The Bible says we have some important things to consider, including the fact that God won't wait forever to resolve the wrongs we have done against an infinity person in himself. In fact, when an aroused infinity person is against injustices and evils, it's a scary, scary thing, the verse we just read. And in this verse, the people who mistreat God's beloved children and those who know him, well, they're going to have a day of reckoning that's especially terrible. And again, just as human crimes that are especially bad deserve a worse punishment, so is true of infinity crimes. Here's the nature of having to balance the scales when there's an infinity on one side in the wrong area, to be wrong. What do we do on the other side? Well, we can either have an infinite amount of intense judgment over a finite time, or a finite amount of judgment over an infinite time. It's the only way we finite people can deal with this infinity problem we have. One option we think we have is to self-pay. Okay, so maybe I can put something on the other side of the scales to balance out that infinity debt of offense and injustice. Well, the Bible says there's nothing we can bring, nothing that valuable we can put on the table that equalizes things out. And even worse, God basically says you might as well give up. Redemption of the soul, equalizing the scales, it's more than we can do, and in fact, we should just give up. There's nothing we can do to equalize it. And since we can't endure an infinite amount of intensity for a finite amount of time, that leaves us with the only option of enduring an infinite amount of time of a limited intensity. That's the only thing that will settle the scales of justice that are tipped against us because we've grieved, offended, and wronged the infinity person. Not a pleasant prospect. And the Bible warns us that at the very end of time, if we're self-paying, God's going to open the books of all the things we've said, thought, felt, and done that are less than perfect, that are offensive and wrong in His sight as the infinitely morally perfect person who is infinitely good, and we haven't been. So self-payers aren't going to fare well in the final judgment. Since we finite people can't possibly equalize the scales, we need an infinite person to do it for us. Interestingly enough, that's what the Bible says God has done. Like it or not, offenses against an infinity person can only be resolved with an infinity. Only that way can the scales of injustice be equalized and righted again. And that is why it's so important that this sensitive and scary topic of final destiny and consequence be understood in light of infinity. How will you resolve your infinity problem against an infinity person?